It was October 23, 1984, at 3:14 a.m., when the contraction hit with enough force to double Sarah Miller over against the kitchen island of her split-level home in Arlington, Virginia. The rain was hammering against the siding, a relentless, cold autumn downpour that blurred the streetlights into hazy orange smears. In the driveway, the engine of the station wagon was already idling, sending plumes of white exhaust into the dark air. Inside the house, the scene was one of typical, frantic domesticity. The grab bag by the door, the phone ringing unanswered, the sudden, sharp realization that the months of planning were over and the reality of parenthood was arriving, violent and immediate. But there was a second frequency of tension in the room, one that Sarah, in her pain, could feel but not decipher. It radiated from her husband, Peter. He was pale, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes darting not to her, but to the window, to the street, to the heavy leather satchel he had insisted on bringing along with the diaper bag. He wasn't acting like a nervous father-to-be. He was acting like a man who heard footsteps behind him that no one else could hear. To understand the gravity of what would transpire in the maternity ward of Arlington Hospital 6 hours later, one must first understand the architecture of the lie that had been constructed around Sarah Miller's life. This was not merely a case of a husband keeping secrets. It was a masterpiece of geopolitical engineering, a deception manufactured in the windowless briefing rooms of Yasenevo, Moscow, and transplanted root and branch into the suburbs of Washington, D.C. The man Sarah knew as Peter Miller, a quiet, bookish consultant who specialized in import-export logistics, did not exist. He was a fiction, a legend in the parlance of the KGB's Directorate S, the elite division responsible for illegals. Deep-cover agents operating without diplomatic immunity, living as ordinary citizens in the heart of the enemy's capital. The Cold War in 1984 was entering a phase of brittle, high-stakes paranoia. The détente of the 1970s had evaporated. In the White House, Ronald Reagan was ramping up rhetoric about the evil empire. In the Kremlin, a gerontocracy led by Konstantin Chernenko was convinced that a NATO nuclear first strike was imminent. The atmosphere was thick with the static of interception and the quiet hum of surveillance. In this ecosystem, the illegal was the ultimate weapon and the ultimate vulnerability. Unlike the legal spies operating out of the Soviet embassy, who could be expelled but rarely imprisoned, the illegal operated without a safety net. If caught, they faced decades in federal prison, or worse. Their safety relied entirely on their ability to blend in, to be so aggressively normal that they became invisible. Peter Miller had been invisible for 8 years. He had paid his taxes, mowed his lawn, complained about the Redskins' defensive line, and married an American woman who worked as a mid-level archivist for the Library of Congress. He was the perfect sleeper, until the water broke. The drive to the hospital was a blur of hydroplaning tires and Sarah's rhythmic breathing, but even through the haze of labor, the anomaly of Peter's behavior began to register. He was driving with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping the leather satchel in the passenger footwell. He checked the rearview mirror constantly, his eyes narrowing at every set of headlights that appeared behind them. When they hit a red light at Glebe Road, he didn't just stop. He watched the intersection with the predatory intensity of a soldier in a kill zone. "Peter, it's okay," Sarah had managed to gasp, assuming his terror was for her, for the baby. "We have time." He hadn't answered. He was muttering something under his breath, a string of rhythmic, almost percussive sounds that didn't sound like English. It was the first crack in the porcelain. They arrived at Arlington Hospital at 3:45 a.m. The triage process was swift. Sarah was wheeled into labor and delivery, the world shrinking down to the sterile white walls, the beep of the fetal monitor, and the crushing waves of pressure. Peter remained by her side, but he was physically rigid. He refused to let the nurses take his coat. He refused to put the leather satchel down in the closet, placing it instead on the floor between his feet, the strap wrapped twice around his ankle. When the doctor asked him to step out for the epidural procedure, Peter argued. He didn't just object. He panicked. He cited hospital policies that didn't exist, his voice rising an octave, his accent, usually a flat, perfect Midwestern drawl, slipping on the vowels, rounding them out in a way Sarah had never heard before. The birth of a child is usually the singular, defining event of a day. But on October 23, 1984, the birth of Sarah and Peter's daughter, Emily, was merely the catalyst for a collision between two massive covert machineries, the KGB's Directorate S and the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. Unknown to Sarah, and only suspected by Peter, the FBI had been watching the Miller residence for 3 weeks. The investigation, codenamed Ghostwood, had not started with Peter. It had started with a burst transmission detected by a mobile listening post in Maryland, a high-speed, encrypted squawk on a frequency used by Soviet naval intelligence. Triangulation had been difficult, the signal bouncing off the dense suburban sprawl, but it had narrowed the source to a 3-block radius in Arlington. Then came the physical surveillance, the bumper beepers attached to cars, the static observation posts in unmarked vans masked as utility repair trucks. The FBI didn't know who Peter Miller really was yet. His legend was backed by forged birth certificates from a town in Ohio that had lost its records in a courthouse fire in the 1950s, a classic KGB tradecraft move. But they knew he was a person of interest. They had been waiting for a mistake, a dead drop gone wrong, a meeting with a handler, a moment of operational indiscipline. They didn't expect the mistake to be a biological imperative. The mistake was the satchel. At 9:12 a.m., Emily was born. The room was filled with the exhausted, tearful relief that follows delivery. Sarah was holding her daughter, her body a wreck, her heart full. Peter was standing by the window, looking through the blinds. He looked shattered, but not with joy. He looked like a man waiting for the executioner. "Peter," Sarah whispered, "come see her." He turned, and for a second the mask slipped entirely. Sarah saw a stranger, a man with cold, calculating eyes that were rapidly assessing exit routes. He moved toward the bed, but his hand went to the satchel on the floor. "I need to go to the car," he said. "I forgot the camera." "We have the camera," Sarah said, confused. "It's in the diaper bag." "No, the other one, the good lens." "Peter, stay, please." He didn't stay. He grabbed the satchel and moved toward the door, but the door opened before he reached it. It wasn't a nurse. It was 2 men in suits that looked slept in, smelling of stale coffee and rain. Behind them, a uniformed police officer blocked the hallway. The air in the room changed instantly, the sterile hospital smell replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. "Peter Miller?" the first man asked. He didn't wait for an answer. "I'm Special Agent Vance, FBI. We need you to step into the hallway." Sarah's first instinct was protection. "What is this?" "We just had a baby. He hasn't done anything." Peter didn't protest. He didn't ask why. He didn't show the righteous indignation of an innocent man. He went perfectly still. It was a reaction drilled into him at the farm, the KGB training facility outside Moscow. When the game is up, conserve energy, assess, deny. "Honey," Peter said, his voice bizarrely calm, It's a misunderstanding. About the consulting firm. I'll clear it up. The bag, Mr. Miller, Agent Vance said, nodding to the satchel. Leave the bag. Peter's grip on the leather handle tightened until his knuckles were white. It's personal effects. Leave the bag. The confrontation lasted 3 seconds, but to Sarah, it felt like an hour. She looked at her husband, the man she had slept beside for 4 years, the man who had painted the nursery yellow because they didn't want to know the gender, the man who made pancakes on Sundays, and she saw him calculate the odds of violence. She saw his muscles coil. She saw him look at the agent's throat, then at the window, then at her. And then he slumped. The fight went out of him. He set the bag down. "I love you, Sarah," he said. It sounded like a line from a movie script, delivered by an actor who didn't quite understand the emotion behind the words. They handcuffed him in the hallway. Sarah could hear the click of the metal, the low murmur of rights being read. Not the Miranda rights she knew from TV, but something else. Something about the Espionage Act. The agents didn't leave Sarah alone. While Peter was taken away, Agent Vance stayed. He closed the door, pulled up a chair, and looked at the woman holding the newborn with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Mrs. Miller," he said quietly, "I know this is difficult, but we need to look at what's in that bag. And for your own safety and the safety of your child, you need to see it too." This is the moment where the psychological reality of the Cold War crashed into the physical reality of Sarah's life. The contents of the satchel were not just evidence. They were the artifacts of a parallel life that had been running alongside her own, invisible and parasitic. Vance opened the bag on the rolling tray table, pushing aside the hospital pitcher and plastic cups. Inside, there was no camera. There was a high-frequency burst transmitter, a device the size of a thick paperback book, housed in a brushed aluminum case with Cyrillic markings on the dials. There was a one-time pad, a small notebook filled with random groupings of numbers, printed on nitrocellulose paper designed to flash burn instantly if touched by a flame. There were 3 passports. One was American, for Peter Miller. One was Canadian, for a man named David Kovich. One was Soviet, for a man named Pyotr Vasilevsky. And there was a map, a standard 8-stray road map of Northern Virginia, but overlaid with a transparent acetate sheet marked with grease pencil. Small red circles dotted the landscape, a park bench in Alexandria, a dead drop site near the Potomac, a signal site on a telephone pole 3 blocks from their house. Sarah stared at the objects. They looked like props. They looked ridiculous. "I don't understand," she whispered. "He's a consultant. He works in logistics. He is a lieutenant colonel in the KGB," Vance said. "He has been operating in the United States since 1976. We believe his primary mission was to cultivate targets within the defense logistics sector. People he met through you. People he met at the parties you hosted." The accusation hung in the air. The parties. The dinner parties Sarah had organized, proud of her husband's charm, his ability to talk to anyone. She thought of their friend Mark, who worked at the Pentagon. She thought of the times Peter had stayed up late drinking with Mark, asking questions that seemed like polite curiosity at the time. How does the supply chain for the new guidance systems work? Is it true the contractors are behind schedule? Sarah looked at her daughter, sleeping oblivious in the swaddle. The baby had Peter's nose. "Is he—" Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. "Is he my husband?" "He is a highly trained intelligence officer," Vance said. "Everything about him, his background, his job, his personality, is a construct. It's a legend. And I'm sorry to tell you this, Mrs. Miller, but you are part of that legend. You provided him with cover. A wife, a house, a child. These are the things that make a man look innocent. They call it light cover versus deep cover. You were the light. The cruelty of the revelation was absolute. Sarah wasn't just a victim. She was a prop. Her marriage wasn't a partnership. It was camouflage. The hours that followed were a blur of bureaucratic intrusion. The hospital room became a temporary interrogation cell. Sarah was not under arrest. The FBI had determined quickly that she was a wittingless asset, a dupe. But she was the primary source of information on the man she thought she knew. They asked her about his travel. Did he ever disappear for long weekends? Yes, for consulting trips to Chicago. Did he ever receive mail at a P.O. box? Not that she knew of. Did he have a shortwave radio? She remembered seeing him in the attic, listening to static. He had told her he was an amateur radio enthusiast, a ham operator. It seemed so harmless, a nerdy hobby. Now, the FBI explained the reality. The static wasn't static. It was the numbers stations, broadcasts from transmitters in Cuba or Russia, a female voice reading strings of numbers that corresponded to the one-time pads. Cinco, nueve, uno, tres. Instructions, targets, commendations. While Sarah was being debriefed in the maternity ward, Peter, or Pyotr, was being processed at the FBI field office. The transformation was immediate. The nervous husband was gone. In his place was the professional. He refused to speak, demanded a representative from the Soviet embassy, and sat in stone-faced silence. He knew the game. He knew that eventually a trade would be arranged. A captured CIA asset in Moscow for him. He just had to wait. But for Sarah, there was no trade. There was only the dismantling of the past. The FBI executed a search warrant on their house in Arlington that afternoon. Sarah wasn't there to see it, but the neighbors were. They watched as agents carried out boxes of files, a hollowed-out fake rock from the garden used for dead drops, and a high-powered camera hidden inside a hollowed-out volume of an encyclopedia. They found cash, stacks of used 20s and 50s totaling $40,000, taped behind the drywall in the basement. The most damning discovery, however, was found in Peter's study. It wasn't a weapon or a code book. It was a journal, not an operational log, but a personal one, written in Russian. Days later, an FBI translator would read portions of it to Sarah. She needed to know, she had insisted. She needed to know if any of it was real. The journal entries were clinical, analytical observations of American life. He critiqued the culture, the consumerism, the softness of the people. But there were entries about Sarah, too. Subject S is stable, unquestioning. Her affection is useful. It grounds the legend. She suspects nothing. The pregnancy complicates the extraction timeline, but enhances the cover. A father is less suspect than a bachelor. Subject S. That was her name in his true life. Not Sarah, not Honey, Subject S. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just that he was a spy. It was that he was an actor who had never broken character, not even in their most intimate moments. The love she felt was real. The love he projected was tradecraft. The aftermath of the arrest was a slow-motion car crash that lasted for years. The story hit the papers, of course. Spy dad arrested in maternity ward. The sensationalism was voracious. Sarah couldn't go back to the house in Arlington. It was a crime scene, a tourist attraction, a mausoleum of lies. She moved in with her parents in Ohio, taking Emily with her. Peter was indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit espionage. He never stood trial. 6 months after his arrest, in a foggy dawn exchange on a bridge in Berlin, the Glienicke Bridge, the bridge of spies, he was walked across the demarcation line. He was traded for 2 dissidents and a captured American pilot. He walked into the mist of East Germany without looking back. He didn't ask to see Sarah. He didn't ask about Emily. The mission was over. The legend was discarded. For Sarah, the questions lingered long after the headlines faded. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed, but the personal wreckage remained. She raised Emily alone, telling her a sanitized version of the truth, that her father was a man who got into trouble and had to leave. But the psychological impact of the deception was a permanent scar. Sarah found herself unable to trust. If a man as perfect as Peter could be a fiction, then what was reality? Every time a new partner was late coming home, every time a phone rang at an odd hour, the panic returned. The paranoia that the FBI agents lived with professionally had become her personal default. Years later, in the late 1990s, after the Soviet archives were partially opened, Sarah received a letter. It had no return address, but the postmark was from Vienna. It was brief. It was handwritten. The work was the work. The duty was the duty. But the girl, she was not part of the plan. She was the only thing that was not a lie. I hope she has your eyes. It was signed simply, P. Sarah burned the letter. It offered no redemption. It was just another manipulation, another piece of psychological tradecraft from a ghost. The case of Peter Miller, Pyotr Vasilevsky, remains a classic study in the annals of counterintelligence. It is taught at Quantico as a lesson in the depth of Soviet penetration and the patience of the long game. But for the woman who lived it, the lesson was different. It wasn't about geopolitics or ideology. It was about the terrifying unknowability of other people. We assume that the people we share our lives with are transparent to us. We assume that intimacy equals knowledge. But the spy in the maternity ward proved that it is possible to share a bed, a home, and a child with a stranger. On that rainy October morning in 1984, Sarah Miller didn't just give birth to a daughter. She gave birth to a new worldview, one stripped of the comforting illusions of suburbia. She learned that the world is a place of layers, of masks beneath masks, where the person holding your hand might be fighting a war you didn't even know existed. The Cold War was often described as a wilderness of mirrors. Sarah had lived in that wilderness, thinking it was a garden until the glass shattered. The enduring image of that day remains: the leather satchel on the hospital floor. In it lay the tools of betrayal, the radio, the codes, the map. But next to it, in the diaper bag Sarah had packed, were the tools of hope, the onesies, the blankets, the camera. 2 futures sitting side by side in the sterile light of the recovery room. One was a lie that had lasted 8 years. The other was a life that was just beginning. Sarah chose the life. She picked up the baby, turned her back on the empty space where her husband had stood, and began the long, hard work of determining what was real. The operational mechanics of the Miller case revealed the extraordinary discipline of the Directorate S illegals. The burst transmitter found in the bag was a marvel of 1980s engineering. Unlike the slow Morse code tapping of World War II, this device allowed an agent to record a message, compress it into a microsecond screech of data, and transmit it to a passing satellite or a listening post at an embassy. It was nearly impossible to triangulate because it was on the air for such a short time. Peter had been careless to bring it to the hospital, but the FBI analysis suggested he had been planning a transmission that very morning, a message to Moscow confirming his status or perhaps requesting extraction. The stress of the labor had forced a collision of his two timelines. He had to be the husband and the spy simultaneously, and the cognitive load caused the fatal error. The one-time pad was equally significant. In the world of cryptography, it is the only theoretically unbreakable code. As long as the key is truly random, used only once, and kept secure, the message cannot be cracked. Peter's pad was hidden inside a hollowed-out, soothing teething ring in the diaper bag, a detail that only emerged during the deep search of the evidence. He had literally hidden the keys to his treason inside the accessories of his child. This detail, perhaps more than any other, haunted the FBI agents who worked the case. It showed a level of compartmentalization that bordered on sociopathy. To look at a teething ring and see a vessel for state secrets requires a mind that has divorced itself from human sentiment entirely. Yet, the dossier on Pyotr Vasilevsky, compiled by the KGB, later leaked in the Mitrokhin archive, suggested a crack in the armor. His handlers had noted in 1983 that Agent Argon, his code name, was becoming too attached to the legend. He had requested permission to buy a vacation home. He had asked about the long-term feasibility of retiring in place. These were red flags for Moscow. A spy who falls in love with his cover is a spy who is about to defect. Was Peter planning to stay? Was the panic in the hospital the panic of a man who wanted to be caught? Or a man who was terrified of losing the life he had stolen? The ambiguity is the hallmark of the espionage narrative. We want clear villains and heroes, but often we get desperate men trapped in machines of their own making. The discovery of the husband spy is a trope in fiction, but in reality, it is a logistical nightmare. The dismantling of the Miller household took months. The FBI had to trace every check Peter had written, every trip he had taken. They interviewed the neighbors, the mailman, the grocer. He was such a nice guy, they all said. He always salted the sidewalk when it snowed. This is the camouflage of the illegal, aggressive normalcy. The banality of evil is not just a philosophical concept. It is a tactical requirement. Sarah's journey through the legal system was harrowing. She was subjected to polygraphs. She was questioned about her own work at the Library of Congress. Did she unknowingly pass information? She hadn't. Her work was in 19th century agricultural records, of zero value to the Kremlin. But the suspicion clung to her. Friends drifted away. The stigma of the traitor's wife was a heavy cloak. She eventually changed her name. She moved to a different state. She built a life that was smaller, quieter, and fiercely private. She told Emily the truth when the girl was 18. Emily, who had grown up with a vague sense of absence, listened to the story of the hospital, the bag, and the arrest with a strange detachment. To her, it was history. To Sarah, it was memory. The legacy of the case is still discussed in the intelligence community. It changed how the FBI vetted the spouses of suspected foreign agents. It changed the protocols for hospital surveillance. But for the participants, the legacy is measured in lost time and shattered trust. In the end, the story of the pregnant wife and the KGB spy is not just about the Cold War. It is about the terrifying proximity of the unknown. We live our lives in concentric circles of trust. Family, friends, community, nation. We assume the inner circle is the safest. But the Miller case reminds us that sometimes the threat is not at the gate. It is in the room. It is holding your hand. It is packing the diaper bag. The rain that fell on Arlington that morning washed away the autumn leaves, but it couldn't wash away the truth that had been exposed. The house on the quiet street was eventually sold. New people moved in. They painted over the yellow nursery. They tore down the drywall in the basement where the money had been hidden. They lived their lives, oblivious to the ghosts in the walls. But for Sarah, the house would always be the set of a play she didn't know she was performing in. And the curtain call came not with applause, but with the click of handcuffs and the cry of a newborn baby, echoing in the sterile silence of a hospital corridor. The timeline of the operation, reconstructed by counterintelligence historians, reveals the sheer scope of the deception. Peter arrived in the U.S. in 1976 via Canada. He spent 2 years building his legend in Chicago before moving to D.C. He met Sarah in 1978 at a mixer for government employees. The courtship was rapid. Moscow approved the marriage within 3 months. They saw Sarah not as a person, but as a validating asset. A single man in D.C. draws attention. A married man with a mortgage is invisible. The tragedy is that the marriage for Sarah was the central pillar of her existence. For Peter, it was a layer of insulation. Or was it? The debate continues. Did he love her in his own way? Can a lie eventually become the truth if you live it long enough? The illegals program continued long after Peter was swapped. In 2010, the FBI rolled up a network of 10 Russian sleepers in the U.S. The ghost stories ring. They lived in suburbs, had children, grew hydrangeas. When the news broke, Sarah, then in her 60s, watched the footage on television. She saw the neighbors interviewed, saying the same things her neighbors had said. They seemed so normal. She turned off the TV. She knew the script. She knew the ending. The day she gave birth was the day she died, in a sense. The Sarah who believed in the transparency of the world ceased to exist. The woman who survived was harder, wiser, and infinitely more alone. But she had Emily, and in the end, the biological reality of the child was the only thing that defeated the ideological fiction of the spy. The KGB could fabricate a name, a history, and a passport. They could not fabricate the bond between mother and child. That was the one frequency they couldn't jam, the one code they couldn't crack. When Emily had her own first child, years later, Sarah sat in the waiting room. She held her purse tightly on her lap. She watched the door. She watched the husbands pacing in the hallway. She scanned their faces, looking for the telltale signs, the tightness around the eyes, the glance at the watch, the sweat on the brow. She was looking for the spy. She knew he was unlikely to be there, but she looked anyway. Once you have seen the man behind the mask, you never stop looking for the seams. The nurse called her name. "Grandma? You can come in now." Sarah stood up. She let go of the purse. She walked into the room to meet her grandson. The cycle of life continued, indifferent to the wars of nations. But as she held the baby, she whispered a promise into his ear, a promise born in the wreckage of 1984. "I will see you," she whispered. "I will really see you. No secrets, no masks, just you." It was the only victory she could claim from the wreckage of the Cold War, a promise of truth, whispered in the dark, against the silence of the secrets that surround us all. The dossier was closed. The operation was terminated. But the human cost remains, a silent tally mark in the long, gray history of the secret world. The spy went home to a country that no longer exists. The wife stayed in a reality that had been shattered, and the child grew up in the space between, a living testament to the fact that love and betrayal can share the same blood. The rain in Arlington has long since dried, but the chill remains. It is the chill of knowing that the person closest to you is the one person you can never truly know. And that is the ultimate legacy of the spy in the nursery. The permanent haunting question of, who is this really? The mechanisms of the state are vast and cold. They grind up lives and spit out history, but in the center of the machine, there is always a heartbeat. Fast, terrified, and human. On that day in 1984, the heartbeat belonged to a man caught between two worlds, and a woman who watched her world dissolve. The rest is just paperwork. The final report on Operation Ghostwood runs to 4,000 pages. It details the frequencies, the dead drops, the meetings. It lists the damage assessment, minimal, in strategic terms. But the damage to the soul of Sarah Miller is not recorded in the files. It is not classified. It is simply carried day after day, a silent burden of the woman who discovered that her life was a ghost story, written by men she never met, for a war she didn't fight. The radio in the attic is gone. The codes are burned. The map is shredded. But the memory of the satchel on the floor remains. It is the monument to the lie. And it stands there still, in the corner of Sarah's mind. A reminder that the most dangerous spies are not the ones who climb fences or steal documents. They are the ones who say, "I love you," and mean I am hiding. The paradox of the sleeper agent is that to succeed, they must become the mask. They must live the lie so fully that it becomes their truth. Did Peter Miller forget sometimes that he was Pyotr? Did he look at Sarah and see his wife or his cover? In the frantic moments before the FBI burst in, when he looked at the bag and then at the baby, what did he see? Did he see his duty or his daughter? We will never know. The spy took that secret with him across the bridge, and Sarah was left with the silence of the nursery, the silence of the empty house, the silence of a phone that no longer rang with calls from a husband who was just checking in. It was a silence that screamed. And in that silence, Sarah Miller rebuilt her world, brick by brick, truth by truth. It was a smaller house, but it was hers, and the walls were solid, and the doors were locked, and she held the key. The Cold War ended for the world in 1991. It ended for Sarah Miller at 9:12 a.m. on October 23, 1984. The moment the handcuffs clicked, the wall came down, and she was left standing in the rubble holding a baby, blinking in the harsh light of the reel. The story of the pregnant wife and the spy is a warning. It is a tragedy. But ultimately, it is a story of survival. The survival of the human spirit against the machinery of deception. Sarah survived. Emily survived. The truth survived. And the spy? He vanished into the gray mist of history. A man who was everyone and no one. A ghost who haunted a house in Arlington for 8 years, and then simply woke up. But Sarah never went back to sleep. She stayed awake. She watched. She listened. And she never, ever trusted a leather satchel again. The file is closed. The names are redacted. The dates are archived. But the story remains. A cold whisper in the ear of anyone who thinks they know the person sleeping next to them. Do you? Are you sure? Look closer. The rain is falling again. The streetlights are blurring. And somewhere in a quiet suburb, a phone is ringing. Who is answering, and who are they, really? The end of the story is not a period. It is a question mark. And it hangs over every marriage, every trust, every secret kept in the dark. The legacy of Peter Miller is not the secrets he stole. It is the doubt he left behind. And that, perhaps, was the most successful operation of all. The planting of doubt, the weaponization of intimacy, the Cold War of the heart. It continues. It always continues. In the silence between heartbeats, in the space between words, in the shadow of the bag by the door. The spy is gone, but the fear remains. And the baby, now a woman, looks at her own husband and wonders. And the cycle turns, and the rain falls, and the world spins on, a globe of secrets, spinning in the dark. The truth is out there, but it is also in here, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the nursery, waiting to be born, waiting to be found, waiting, just waiting for the water to break and the real to begin. The operational footprint of the Miller case extended far beyond the domestic tragedy. In the months following the arrest, the FBI conducted a thorough damage assessment known as a bleed-out analysis. They needed to know if Peter had compromised other agents, if he had identified CIA officers, if he had poisoned the logistics data of the Pentagon. The investigation revealed that Peter had been a spotter as much as a collector. He hadn't just been stealing plans. He had been assessing people. He had built psychological profiles of dozens of defense contractors, looking for weaknesses, gambling debts, marital problems, alcoholism. These profiles were sent to Moscow via the burst transmitter and dead drops. Sarah realized, with a sickening jolt during a later debriefing, that her social circle had been a hunting ground. The barbecues in the backyard, the Christmas parties, the casual dinners, they were all harvesting operations. Peter would mix the drinks, tell jokes, and listen. He would remember who complained about their security clearance review. He would remember who bought a new car they couldn't afford. He was a predator disguised as a host. This realization retroactively poisoned Sarah's entire adult life. Every happy memory was tainted. The time Peter comforted her friend Linda after a divorce, he wasn't being kind. He was assessing Linda's vulnerability for recruitment. The time he helped Mark with his resume, he was looking for access points to classified projects. The kindness was weaponized. The empathy was tactical. This is the specific horror of the deep cover agent. They don't just steal secrets, they steal humanity. They mimic the best parts of human connection, friendship, love, support, and turn them into tools of the state. It is a violation that goes deeper than treason. It is a metaphysical rape of the community. The FBI agents, Miller and Vance, eventually closed the case. They moved on to other targets, other spies, but they stayed in touch with Sarah for a while. Not as friends, but as custodians of the wreckage. They helped her navigate the name change. They helped her secure her credit, which Peter had entangled with his operational funds. They were the cleanup crew for a disaster that had no physical debris, only emotional fallout. Sarah's life stabilized. She went back to school. She became a librarian, surrounded by books, by facts, by things that could be cataloged and verified. She found comfort in the Dewey Decimal System, in the order of things. There were no secrets in the library. Everything was on the shelf, labeled, accessible. It was the anti-espionage. But she never remarried. The risk was too high. The pattern recognition software in her brain was permanently set to high alert. She saw potential spies everywhere. The man at the grocery store who paid with exact change, suspicious. The neighbor who jogged at the same time every morning. Surveillance. It was an exhausting way to live, but it was the only way she felt safe. Emily grew up with a mother who was loving but vigilant. Sarah taught her daughter to be observant. Watch people's hands, she would say. Listen to what they don't say. It was a strange education for a child, a curriculum of counterintelligence passed down like a family recipe. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Sarah watched it on TV with Emily. They saw the crowds surging, the concrete crumbling. "Is Daddy there?" Emily asked. She was 5 years old. "I don't know," Sarah said. "Maybe." "Is he a bad man?" "He worked for the bad guys," Sarah said carefully. "But he loved you." "I think he loved you." It was the most generous thing she could say. It was the only truth she could offer that didn't burn. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought a flood of information. The Mitrokhin archive, the Vasily Nikitin papers, the secret history of the KGB was laid bare. Researchers found references to the Arlington residency. They found performance reviews of Agent Argon. One review, dated 1982, stood out. Agent Argon is performing adequately, but shows signs of bourgeois assimilation. He enjoys the cover life too much. He has requested to purchase a boat. He spends too much time on home improvement projects. We must remind him of his true purpose. Sarah read this in a book published in 2002. She sat in her kitchen and wept. Not for Peter, but for the man who wanted a boat. The man who fixed the deck. The man who was fighting against his own programming to be happy. It was a tragedy of multiple layers. Peter was a victim of the KGB too. They had taken a young man, stripped him of his identity, and sent him to live a lie. And when the lie became too comfortable, they reeled him in. Or rather, the FBI did it for them. Perhaps Peter's arrest was a rescue. Perhaps in the gulag of his own mind, the handcuffs were a liberation. He didn't have to pretend anymore. He didn't have to remember which lie he had told to whom. He could just be Pyotr again. But Pyotr was a stranger to Sarah. She mourned Peter Miller. She mourned the fiction. It is a strange thing to grieve for a person who never existed. It is a grief without a grave. The story of the pregnant wife and the spy fades into history, becoming a footnote in the long struggle between East and West. But in the quiet moments, when the rain hits the window in a certain way, Sarah still feels the echo of that night. The contraction, the car ride, the fear, and the realization that the scariest thing in the world is not the enemy you face, but the enemy you embrace. The day she gave birth was the day the world broke, and she has been gluing it back together, piece by piece, ever since. The glue is truth. The glue is love for her daughter. The glue is the refusal to be a victim. She is Sarah. She is real, and that is enough. The dossier is closed. The legend is dead. The life continues.